Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. A new study by Boston Consulting Group asks a deceptively simple question. What do Malaysians really dream of? Moving beyond traditional economic indicators, the report looks at how people define progress in their own lives. And tonight on the show, we'll examine what these aspirations reveal, what it says about what Malaysians may be quietly telling us about how they see economic pressure, well-being, and the systems our countrymen rely on. So today on the show, we have the good folks behind the report, My Impian, Uncovering the Malaysian Dream, Nurlin Mohd Salleh, Managing Director, Partner and Head of Boston Consulting Group Malaysia, and Anis Mohd Nor, Partner at Boston Consulting Group. Welcome to the show. It's great of you to join me.
Thank you.
What an interesting report. And I have to say, I approached the report thinking, I intuitively feel like I might know what the findings are, but I feel there's so much depth in it that we might need to uncover today. So if I may begin with you, Anis, let's talk a little bit about what the reasons for the survey, because, you know, I thought I knew what it was, but what was it that you were trying to discover by putting this survey together?
No, thanks so much for having us on the show, Melissa. I think when we approached this report, what we were seeing in the national level conversations is when we talk about development and progress in Malaysia, a lot of the conversations really focus on macroeconomic indicators, right? So what's happening with GDP, what's happening with income, where are we tracking in terms of rankings, be it national or international. However, what's probably lacking in the conversation is a real understanding of like what is it that actually Malaysians want and what do they dream about, right? And are they moving any closer to these dreams and ambitions? So that led us to wanting to unpack this topic a bit further and the birth of the My Impian Malaysia, Uncovering the Malaysian Dreams. We approached it by trying to shift the conversation beyond macro indicators to really about people, about Malaysians. And we asked them three simple questions. One, what is your dream, right? What is it that you dream about? Second, how close are you to achieving these dreams? And thirdly, I think it's very important when we talk about aspirations and dreams, it's about trade-offs, right? Because not everything that we want, we might necessarily get. So really understanding from the respondents, what are the trade-offs that you're making now or you're thinking about in the future to achieve these dreams? And the intent is really to kind of get these really people-centered answers to help guide, insights and decision-making, be it with policymakers, employers, right? To really put a voice around what individuals want versus just looking at the macroeconomic indicators.
That was another question I wanted to ask you as to who the report was for. And you've just answered that, saying that hopefully policymakers see beyond the numbers, the statistics, and see the aspirations, the hopes of people behind or who the policies were meant for. And I want to go to the very top dream of most of your respondents, which is financial freedom. And that's intuitive. All of us want financial freedom. But what I did notice was that the respondents defined it as being debt-free and free from constant worry, as opposed to being affluent, which is what I thought most people would have said. I want to be rich. I want to travel. I want all the trimmings of life. How do you interpret that, Nurlin?
Maybe I start off with sort of following on from what Anis was saying, right? We wanted to conduct this study because we wanted to understand what Malaysians truly wanted. And I think everyone had a certain view of what they thought Malaysians wanted, right? They were like, I know this is what they want, so on and so forth. Correct. An assumption, right? Which I was just like, is that assumption actually correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Right? And so that's why we then conducted this study. The second part of it was also because we have all these great plans in place. Malaysia, very good at plans. And then the question is actually, do our overall ambition and aspiration for the country match what each individual Malaysians collectively wanted? And I wasn't sure. Right? And hence, that was the reason as well why we were asking ourselves these three questions that Anis had highlighted. Now, what's interesting is the top dream is financial freedom, exactly as you said. So 67% of respondents said financial freedom. What's interestingly, which maybe we touch upon a little later, is that the second top dream, which is at about 66%, because we were asking people to rate their top 5 dreams. Second dream is actually physical and mental health, right? And so that in itself was interesting because who would have known, right? Malaysians, we thought, okay, financial freedom, 100%, but wow, the other dream, which is physical and mental health, is
and equally, almost equally,
equally on par with each other, right? Then going back to your question about financial freedom, exactly as you said, we were like, okay, maybe the top dream, I think in the past people expected the top dream was about, I want to own my own house. I want to own my own car, which in some ways you could say could be considered something a bit more affluent in nature. But actually, the financial freedom, what it meant is they want to be debt-free. They want to not worry about having to pay for basic necessities. They want to ensure they have saved enough for retirement. They want to ensure they can spend easily without having the burden and stress of really thinking through what the challenges are. The other aspects which we asked them, things associated with buying luxury items, taking risks, going on vacation and holiday, really lower along the list as well. Yeah, even amongst, I would say, the affluent groups
But
as well.
isn't that a bit worrying? Because for me, when dreams are meant to be aspirational,
Exactly.
right? I looked at the finding and I was a bit sad for all of us in general because now dreams are no longer about getting ahead, but rather just staying afloat.
Correct.
And that's a bit heartbreaking for me.
Correct. And I think it's also an indicator of the times that we've been through, right? We've been through COVID, which had involved people having to dip into their retirement and savings to be able to remain afloat. There's more of an awareness of the fact that I need to be a little bit more conscious and worried about, the next emergency, the next financial crisis, the next situation that's going to get me in a challenging position, and therefore actually my dream is I want to make sure I can stay afloat comfortably in the coming years.
I really do think the past few years have been such a shock to the system
Very
that
much
we've
so.
really recalibrated what our dreams are.
expectations.
Absolutely. The other segment, I would say, of the report that really broke my heart a bit was gig workers. So this is also a new development in our country. Gig workers only around for the past 5-6 years now. Your report found that gig workers feel the furthest from achieving their dreams. And how do we make sense of that? That they feel so far from where they would like to be. Nurlin.
So if you think about gig workers and how the gig workforce came about, it really came about during that period of COVID, right? Because people were losing their jobs, and so they wanted opportunities that gave them a bit more flexibility, right? And therefore, more gig workers came about. The positive part about working in the gig economy is that flexibility and being able to work in different areas and to really shift around as much as possible, right? Which is fantastic and actually hits on that second dream probably of being able to be a bit more physical and mental well-being that you get.
Yes.
But on the flip side is it doesn't give you financial security, right? Because it's a bit more of an inconsistent model of working, therefore potentially inconsistent pay, inconsistent compensation, which then leads you to the volatility of that life, right? And if you go back then to the first dream of I want financial freedom, to be debt-free, to have sufficient savings, so on and so forth, it doesn't hit those. It doesn't hit those dreams. And so if you ask them the second question that Anis talks about, not just what is your dream, but how far are you from achieving that dream? Interestingly, when you break down the demographics, the gig workforce felt the furthest away from achieving that dream. So that's where, as you said, your heart breaks because you're like, oh gosh, there's a larger population of Malaysians that have decided to go into the gig workforce because of circumstances or context and so on and so forth, and a way of life which they wanted. However, now they're realizing that, hey, it's allowing me to provide that flexibility to myself, but I'm not achieving that top dream which I have.
I think that second question is so important, isn't it? How far away are you from the dream? Because it also speaks to how hopeful you are of the trajectory of the country, of the trajectory of your life. Anis, how do you see policymakers or interventions that might help narrow this dream gap for gig workers?
So I think the point you brought up, Melisa, just now is really important. Gig workers is a fairly new development in our country, but actually it's really sizable, right? So I think data as of last year said there's 1.2 million gig workers in Malaysia currently, and this is formal data, right? There's a lot of people in the gig economy, which is a bit more informal, so probably the number is even bigger than that. What's also interesting is, I think, as Nurlin mentioned, it sort of started during COVID and all that, and people saw this as, sort of a temporary kind of way of work where I can go in and out, it's flexible, etc. But what you're actually seeing is some people are actually choosing this as, in a way, a career, right? I want to be part of the gig economy, so it's not going to go away, and it's actually going to be sizable. So it is a segment that we need to focus on. Now, in terms of policymakers, there's been a lot of good progress. So last year, the Gig Workers Bill 2025 represented actually a really positive trajectory in terms of how we support this segment, right? So the bill talked about, actually recognizing gig workers as a distinct kind of worker group, right? So recognizing that, yes, it doesn't look like traditional employment, but this is, a type of employment that is going to be recognized in our country. Second, there was also talk about including social protections for gig workers, which traditionally they didn't have access to, right? So this would be stuff like SOCSO protection. So now in case they have, injuries while they're doing their gig work or disabilities, etc., they now have access to the type of social protections that traditional workers would have access to. Last but not least, also there was this introduction of dispute resolution. As you can imagine, informal economy, lots of different platforms, lots of different issues, and before this there was a little bit of a lack of where do gig workers kind of bring their issues for resolution. So this gig worker tribunal was introduced, and I think that's the kind of the positive steps that we're making to try to support gig workers so they get closer to their dreams. I think in terms of policymakers, what's going to be really important going forward is implementation, right? Typically, one is compliance, right? So whether platform providers themselves are going to be complying to all these new guidance from the government, so making sure that we're enforcing it. Second, the specificity, right, of the coverage, like who's included, who's not included, what type of benefits, etc., is going to be really important. And last but not least, I think access as well. So Nurlin later will talk a little bit about geographical coverage. We know that a lot of big gig platforms are mainly in the urban areas, right? So I won't name them, but I'm sure
we all know them.
There's a few that come to mind. But there are also people in the gig economy that might not be on these big platforms in more rural areas, right? So how do we make sure that it's not just about the big rural areas and people on the big platforms, but the other type of gig economy workers are also covered? So I think these are the three things that we need to continue doubling down on to make sure that the gig workers are getting closer to achieving their dreams.
And we really can't ignore it's a huge segment of society. And clearly from your research, your report, that they really need to feel supported in some way so that they feel that they can achieve some of their dreams. I want to come to that 66% of physical and mentally physically and mentally well, the second most selected dream. What I thought was particularly interesting was why people felt, how far they felt from that dream. The second question, back to that again. And the biggest barriers to wellness that your respondents highlighted was stress and time related. It's not so much medical, it's the lifestyle. So what does that reflect about the way we are living in this kind of post-COVID world?
Yeah,
may come to you.
100%. And so again, I think in Malaysia, if you think about it, our assumption was always top dream, financial freedom. Less so on the physical and mental wellness. And the thinking was, I think, that a lot of this is more something for the younger generations, right? The older generations.
Especially the mental well-being. Imagine this being a top priority not 5-6 years ago. And now we are talking about this as a primary aspiration.
Exactly. But I don't think many people fully appreciate and realize that, right? Agree. And so we then unpacked a bit deeper, like actually what exactly is impeding people from being able to achieve this dream, right? And the top four out of 5 are things related to lack of exercise, poor sleeping patterns, poor eating habits, and stress and anxiety related to family, work, or other issues, right? Those are the top 4. There is a 5th, which is around natural ailments due to aging, but these are the 4 that you're thinking about. So the focus on a healthier way of life, whether that's through exercise, better eating, better sleep patterns, is not a commonly looked after area, I would say. I think there's more and more interest. I mean, you see more excitement around doing sporting events, highlighting the importance of sleep and how to manage that, so on and so forth. But the level of focus that it's been given compared to other areas is very, very low in comparison. So actually, I think this report helped us to understand that you need to realize that people's aspirations and ambitions individually is changing with time. You need to be aware of that and then see what needs to be done, whether it's both from a policy standpoint or from a private sector company standpoint, employer standpoint. We need to evolve and make sure we are aware of that.
But when you talk about how it changes and evolves, did the survey find distinct differences or any material differences between, you talked about ex-husband earlier, between geographical locations? I'm just wondering whether are some of these universal aspirations or are some more kind of urban-centric? Because think about the being stuck in traffic and how much that relates to the stress of a daily commute.
Yes.
And I'm also curious to know how the differences between gender. Do women dream of different things than men? Do younger people dream of different things than an older generation? What did you find?
So maybe I start first. So we also looked at it from understanding how much consensus there was between the top 2 dreams. And actually from a consensus standpoint across Malaysia, regardless of demographic splits, there's huge consensus amongst those 2 being the top 2 dreams.
Okay.
If we go a little bit deeper from a gender standpoint, men and women, actually, women place physical and mental well-being a bit higher than financial freedom, right? And that you can think about it and unpack it more in terms of the fact that, they take on more responsibilities and more burden when it comes to household, home, family responsibilities, and as a result are having to potentially juggle more different things to think about.
Care work comes into play.
Correct. The caregiving work comes into play, and that's where the challenges lie. And, we're moving towards a society which needs to bring more and more women back into the workforce, right? So that burden becomes even heavier for women as well. So that's sort of the split between gender. From an age standpoint, as expected, there are differences. If you think about the younger generations, they are, as you expect, more individualistic in nature. They are focusing more on achieving their individual ambitions and dreams. And what's great about it is you could say that they have that ambition and drive to be able to take more risks, right? As part of this report, we also broke down the demographics into what we call archetypes. And there are 4 main archetypes that we looked at, right? You have your go-getters, your legacy makers, your harmony seekers, and your providers. Those are the 4.
So go-getters, harmony seekers,
legacy makers and providers.
And providers.
Right.
And these are broadly the types of people that in your
the
respondents.
archetypes that we split up into these 4 archetypes, right? What I found really interesting was the biggest groups are actually your providers and your harmony seekers, right? Providers are the guys who basically have the caregiving responsibilities, who have to look after family, home, and therefore their focus is, I want financial security for my family.
Right. Okay.
Harmony seekers are the guys who basically want that harmonious way of life that has a good balance. It fits very well with your top 2 dreams, right? Then you've got these other 2 categories of go-getters and legacy makers, which are, if you think about it, potentially the guys who will really make real changes and drives and take risks. Right, in driving our economy and our country forward, right?
But may I interrupt very quickly? You saw the harmony seekers and the providers, you said, were the biggest categories?
The biggest categories, that's right. So if you want the numbers for that, I can give you the numbers for that.
I guess what I'm asking is, if it's majority the providers and the harmony seekers, and the people who are willing to take the risks and want to be bold and
ambitious,
be ambitious, are the minority, are we thinking more about the minority over what the majority wants?
Exactly.
Yes, although, okay, so the part that concerns me a little bit is, again, we have all these plans, right? Which is important for economic growth for the country. We really want the country to progress and move forward. We want to become a high income nation and so on and so forth. And so there are certain growth areas that really need to be pushed and developed. And that's where you need your go-getters, and that's where you need your legacy makers to really drive and push that forward. But they represent a smaller percentage than your harmony seekers and providers who are looking for that balance. So this is the part where I'm like, this is the part where I'm like, there's a bit of a discrepancy between these are what our plans are and these what our dreams are. How do we bring those closer together?
I see it now. I'm connecting the dots. Anis, what did you think? So one of the things that also that Nurlin mentioned about younger people being individualistic in nature. I'm curious to know about that. And I'm curious to know about how younger people dream, what their dreams are for themselves, because they're the future of the country, essentially. Are we getting, do we understand what they're dreaming about?
No, it's interesting that you brought up young people, because actually the other interesting insight that we got from the study was the demographic, right, in Malaysia, because one thing that I think we need to understand for Malaysia as well in the next few years, we're going to go through a big demographic change, right? So we're not, yes, young people will continue to be important. We say they're going to be the next future generation, etc. But the trends are actually showing that, you know, one, Malaysians are living longer, right? Two, people are having less children. And three, the size of the working population is actually growing at a slower rate than it was before. So, you know, all the indicators are showing we're actually moving towards an aging population, right? So the young people will come in, but they're going to stay in the workforce longer, and then that pool will kind of shrink, right? So an understanding of this demographic is also really important for us as a country, because I think, as Nurlin said, when we looked at the cuts by age, if you look at the older population, they are looking more for stability, continuity, right? So an example is like the legacy makers. So they're still driven, but they want, it's all about long-term stability and continuity. So I think the other thing that came out of the study was, as we look at all these national level policies, etc., how do these different demographic insights also influence how we think about policies, right? So maybe it's not just about, you know, pursuing fast-paced growth in the short term, but about really long term, right? Sustainability, continuity, etc. So,
and to incorporate some of these more balanced aspirations into the policy, into the grand national plan. On that note, I want to ask you, in the time that we have left, what are you hoping policymakers take from this report? Because I see now there is a gap between maybe policymakers' dream for Malaysia and Malaysians' dream for ourselves. So talk to me about who was the primary audience, and how can, I guess, different segments use some of these findings, because it's not just policymakers. I'm sure businesses, private sector can glean from this as well. I'm going to start with Nurlin first.
So, so I think for me, it's exactly as you said, which is the fact that there's, in my view, a discrepancy, right? We have these wonderful plans, and I have been very excited about these wonderful plans, but then I stopped and thought about it, and I said to myself, is this what Malaysians really want? And do we actually have, I suppose, that engine of the people in the workforce who have aspirations and ambitions which are aligned to achieving these plans, right? And then when we conducted this study, I paused for a bit and I said, okay, maybe there needs to be this gap needs to be filled between the two, right? Financial freedom, yes, we need economic growth to be able to achieve financial freedom, right? We need to bring in the jobs, we need to bring in the high income jobs that can give people the right kind of income and salary and wages that they're looking for. We need to try to increase wages for the people so that they have enough to save and retire and so on and so forth, right? But we cannot forget the second aspiration and dream which they have, which is physical and mental well-being and health. Now, if we are not able to achieve that, they get burnt out, so on and so forth, they're not going to achieve the first ambition, right? So we need to balance between the two. Now, it's important from a policy-making standpoint, but it's also important from a private sector standpoint, right? for organizations, companies, employers to understand and appreciate the fact that different generations have a different way of working. The needs, ambitions, and dreams have evolved, and therefore we need to put in place the right mechanisms, tools, policies within organizations to help our people to succeed, so that we can then collectively succeed together, right? I think that's the part which I think is important, and to constantly ask, and I think it's important for us to constantly ask this question: what are our dreams, and how far are we from achieving those dreams? I go back to the first question which you had, which is why did you want to do this study? It's because we paused and said, and looked at it and said, actually, nobody's asked this question for a very long time.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Right.
We've just been running on this assumption for a long time.
Correct, right? So can we take a step back and really understand what exactly do our people want? What do they exactly see as their dream and ambition?
Anis, do you have anything to add to for our audience today?
No, I think Nurlin covered most of it, but just maybe talking about beyond policy, like Nurlin mentioned, I think employers have a really important role to play, right? The study talks a lot about evolving dreams, evolving preferences, etc. So then employers, I think, also need to be really proactive in terms of thinking about how best to shape the workforce to support that, right? So things like more flexibility in terms of working models, right? Reskilling and upskilling, right? If we go back to the aging thing, people are going to be working longer. They do want to have more income continuity. How do we make sure we bring people along the journey? And then I think, for the private sector, the types of products and services we're offering as well. As Nurlin said, financial freedom means a lot of different things to different people, right? It's not all about getting rich, maybe. It's more about retirement planning, things like that. So I think there's a lot of really useful insights that are very actionable from our study that, private sector players, employers can address. Last but not least, I think one whole thing of the report is that we just wanted to bring this into the national dialogue. So I think just like the conversation we're having here today, right? A lot of the conversations are really about macroeconomic indicators, but how can we have more conversations beyond that to say, let's really humanize it, right? What does that mean? What is it that people actually want? What is the nuance behind, say, financial freedom? What does it actually mean to different people? So just kind of bringing the dialogue to life a little bit more.
I really appreciate both of you coming on the show and telling us more about this report. It's been quite fascinating to ask a question that it is deceptively simple, but so very necessary. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.